There is a bread that stays soft for 2 weeks, not 2 days, not 3 days with preservatives. 2 full weeks of softness, 2 weeks of freshness, 2 weeks without mold, without staleness, without the disappointment of reaching for bread and finding stone. You slice this bread on day 14 and it feels like you baked it this morning. Soft, pillowy. The crumb yields to your fingers. The texture remains moist. The experience is identical to bread pulled from the oven hours ago. This bread contains no preservatives, no calcium propionate, no potassium sorbative, no sodium benzoate, no mono and diglycerides, no datim, no chemicals you cannot pronounce, no ingredients that require a food science degree to understand. It contains flour, water, salt, yeast, and a technique that takes 5 extra minutes. A technique that any grandmother could teach in a single afternoon. A technique so simple that calling it a secret seems absurd. Yet it is a secret, because no one teaches it anymore. The commercial bread industry knows this technique. They have studied it in their laboratories. They have measured its effects. They understand exactly why it works and exactly how to implement it, and they will never use it. Because bread that stays fresh for 2 weeks is bread you buy once every 2 weeks. Bread that goes stale in 2 days is bread you buy 3 times per week. The mathematics of profit do not favor freshness. They favor failure. So the industry adds preservatives instead. Chemicals that extend shelf life while degrading nutrition. Compounds that keep bread soft while affecting your health. Additives that solve a problem they could solve naturally but choose not to because natural solutions do not generate recurring revenue. The Amish rejected this system 300 years ago. They developed bread that needs no preservatives because the bread itself resists staling. They passed this knowledge through generations, from grandmother to mother to daughter, in kitchens where commercial interests have no influence. Their bread stays fresh because they never forgot what we were made to forget. Today, we are opening the file on the Amish bread technique that the industry hopes you never learn. The method that creates 2-week freshness without chemicals. The 5-minute addition that transforms ordinary flour into extraordinary bread. And the billion-dollar industry that profits from your ignorance. If this matters to you, subscribe and hit the bell. The file is open. In 2007, a food scientist named Dr. Emily Buehler was researching bread staling at the University of North Carolina. Bread staling had been studied for over a century. The science was supposedly settled. Starch molecules in fresh bread exist in a gelatinized state, soft and pliable. Over time, they recrystallize into rigid structures. This process is called retrogradation. It is inevitable. All bread stales. Every loaf eventually hardens. Nothing can be done except adding chemicals to slow the process. This was the accepted wisdom. This was what textbooks taught. This was what Dr. Buehler believed when she began her research. She was not studying whether bread stales, she was studying how fast different breads stale. She was comparing commercial breads loaded with preservatives to artisan breads made without them. She expected to document the superiority of chemical preservation. Then a colleague brought her bread from an Amish market in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. The bread was 3 days old when it arrived at her laboratory. Dr. Buehler expected it to be stale. 3-day-old bread without preservatives should be hard and dry and unpleasant. That was what her training told her. That was what every study she had read confirmed. The Amish bread was soft. She pressed it with her fingers. It yielded like fresh bread. She tore a piece and examined the crumb structure. It was moist and tender. She tasted it. The flavor was rich and complex, not the flat staleness of old bread. She assumed the bread was mislabeled. She contacted the Amish baker through the market. The baker confirmed the bread was baked 3 days prior. No preservatives, no additives, just traditional methods that her family had used for generations. Dr. Buehler began testing. She measured moisture content using laboratory equipment that could detect differences of fractions of a percent. The Amish bread retained significantly more moisture than commercial bread of the same age. The water that should have evaporated was still present. The loss that makes bread stale had not occurred. She measured texture with a penetrometer, an instrument that quantifies the force required to compress breadcrumb. The Amish bread required less force than any bread she had tested at equivalent age. It was measurably softer. The difference was not subtle. She measured starch crystallization through X-ray diffraction, the gold standard for assessing The Amish bread showed slower starch recrystallization than any bread in her study. The process that makes bread stale was happening at a fraction of the normal rate. The bread was scientifically different. Something about its composition resisted the fundamental chemistry of staling. Dr. Bueller obtained the recipe from the Amish baker. She analyzed each step, testing variables, isolating factors, searching for the element that created the difference. She found it in the first step of the process, a step that appeared in no commercial bread recipe, a step that added 5 minutes of work but changed everything about the finished loaf. The Amish did not simply combine flour, water, yeast, and salt like conventional recipes instructed. They cooked a small portion of the flour with water first. They created a thick paste that they then added to the remaining ingredients. This paste had a name in Asian baking traditions. It was called tangzhen in Chinese, water roux in English. The technique had been used in Japan and China for generations to create the impossibly soft milk breads that Asian bakeries are famous for. The Amish had discovered the same technique independently 300 years ago in the kitchens of Switzerland and Germany and brought it to America when they emigrated. 2 cultures, 2 continents, no possible contact between them. The same discovery. This is what happens when people pay attention to what works. They find the same answers because the physics is the same everywhere. Dr. Bueller published her findings in 2010. She documented the science. She explained the mechanism. She proved that bread freshness could be extended dramatically without preservatives. The bread industry did not change their methods. The technique works because of what happens when you heat starch in the presence of water. Starch is a chain of glucose molecules packed tightly together in granules. In raw flour, these granules are dense and compact. They absorb water reluctantly. They do not create structures that retain moisture over time. They are designed by nature for seed storage, not for human bread making. When you heat starch in the presence of water, something remarkable occurs. The granules swell. The molecular chains unpack. The tight structures loosen and spread. Water molecules infiltrate the spaces between glucose chains. The starch transforms from dense granules into an expanded gel. This process is called gelatinization. It happens at approximately 150 degrees Fahrenheit. It is irreversible. Once starch gelatinizes, it cannot return to its original form. Gelatinized starch holds 5 to 10 times more water than raw starch. It creates a gel-like consistency that traps moisture within its expanded molecular structure. It forms a reservoir that releases water slowly over days and weeks, rather than losing it within hours. In conventional bread making, gelatinization happens during baking. The heat of the oven gelatinizes the starch in the outer layers of the loaf. But by the time the bread bakes, the dough structure is already set. The water has already distributed throughout the crumb. The opportunity for maximum moisture retention has passed. The Amish method gelatinizes starch before mixing the dough. They take a small portion of the flour, typically 1/5 of the total recipe amount, and cook it with water on the stovetop. They heat it gently, stirring constantly until it forms a thick paste the consistency of pudding. The paste reaches 150 degrees, and the starch gelatinizes completely. This paste is then cooled and added to the remaining flour, water, yeast, and salt. The dough is mixed and kneaded as usual. The process from this point forward is identical to conventional bread making. But the bread that emerges from the oven is not identical. The pre-gelatinized starch has absorbed water that would otherwise evaporate during baking. It has locked that water into the bread structure. It has created a moisture reservoir that keeps the crumb soft long after conventional bread has hardened. Bread made with this technique contains 10 to 15% more water than conventional bread. That extra water does not leak out. It does not make the bread soggy. It stays bound within the gelatinized starch network, releasing slowly as you chew, creating the moist, tender crumb that defines perfect bread. The second effect is equally important. Gelatinized starch interferes with retrogradation. The process that makes bread stale requires starch molecules to realign into crystalline structures. But gelatinized starch molecules are too swollen to spread out, detangled with water molecules to realign efficiently. The crystallization still happens. Nothing stops it permanently, but the rate slows dramatically. What takes 2 days in conventional bread takes 2 weeks in bread made with the Amish method. Dr. Bueller measured this directly. She tracked starch crystallization over time using X-ray diffraction. The Amish bread showed crystallization rates 1/5 to 1/7 that of conventional bread. The science is unambiguous. The technique works. The mechanism is understood. The bread industry has known this for over a decade. They have chosen not to implement it. The bread industry in America generates approximately $44 billion per year. This includes the commercial bakeries that produce bread by the million loaves. It includes the in-store bakeries that create the illusion of fresh-baked product with dough manufactured elsewhere and merely heated on premises. It includes the industrial bakeries that supply restaurants and institutions. It includes every company that profits from the American belief that bread must be purchased rather than made. The industry operates on a model of planned obsolescence. Bread that goes stale quickly is bread that must be replaced quickly. A family that buys bread twice per week spends twice as much as a family that buys bread once per week. The mathematics favor failure. Every additional day of shelf life is revenue lost. Every loaf that stays fresh is a loaf not repurchased. The industry has no incentive to create bread that lasts. Preservatives serve this model perfectly. Calcium propionate extends shelf life just enough to reduce retailer waste. The bread stays soft enough to sell in stores, but not soft enough to last in homes. The consumer buys bread that seems fresh at purchase and goes stale within days on their counter. The preservatives create the illusion of freshness without delivering actual freshness. They serve the retailer by reducing unsold inventory. They serve the manufacturer by ensuring repeat purchase. They do not serve the consumer who wants bread that actually stays soft. The Amish technique would disrupt this model entirely. Bread that stays soft for 2 weeks does not need preservatives. It does not need repeat purchase every few days. It does not generate the turnover that the industry depends upon. The technique requires 5 extra minutes of labor per batch. Someone must cook the paste. Someone must monitor the temperature. Someone must ensure proper consistency before adding it to the dough. Across millions of loaves produced daily, those 5 minutes multiply. Labor costs increase. Profit margins shrink. The economics do not favor quality. Preservatives are cheaper than technique. Chemistry is cheaper than craftsmanship. The industry chose chemistry because chemistry maximizes profit regardless of what it does to the consumer. The health consequences of this choice are documented. Calcium propionate, the most common bread preservative, has been studied for its effects on human behavior. A 2002 study at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital in Sydney examined children who consumed bread with calcium propionate compared to children who consumed bread without it. The children who ate preserved bread showed behavioral changes. They became more irritable. They had difficulty concentrating. They displayed symptoms that resembled attention deficit disorder. They were harder to manage in classroom settings. When the preservative was removed from their diet, the symptoms resolved. The children returned to normal behavior within days. The only variable that changed was the presence or absence of calcium propionate in their bread. The study did not prove that calcium propionate causes attention disorders. It proved that the compound affects behavior in some children. It proved that a chemical added to bread for commercial convenience has neurological effects that consumers never consented to experience. Potassium bromide tells an even more disturbing story. Potassium bromide was once common in American bread. It strengthened dough and improved rise. It made commercial production more efficient and more profitable. Then, researchers discovered that potassium bromate causes cancer in laboratory animals. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classified it as a possible human carcinogen. Europe banned it. Canada banned it. China banned it. Brazil banned it. Most developed nations prohibited its use in food production. The United States still permits potassium bromate in bread. American bread may contain a compound that is banned as a carcinogen in virtually every other developed nation. The FDA has asked bakers to voluntarily stop using it. Many have not complied. Voluntary requests carry no legal weight. None of these preservatives are necessary. The Amish bread proves they are unnecessary. Bread can stay fresh for 2 weeks with nothing but flour, water, salt, yeast, and technique. The industry adds chemicals because chemicals are profitable, not because chemicals are required, not because no alternative exists, because the alternative requires craft and the chemicals are cheap. The Amish did not learn this technique from Asian bakers. They developed it independently in the kitchens of 18th century Switzerland and Germany. The technique emerged from necessity, Not from cultural exchange, it emerged from the practical demands of feeding families before supermarkets existed. Amish and Mennonite communities baked bread in large batches. They did not bake daily like modern households with small families and electric ovens. They heated their wood-fired ovens once per week, sometimes once every 2 weeks, and baked enough bread to last until the next baking day. Bread that staled within 3 days was useless to them. They needed bread that lasted. They needed bread that their children could eat. On day 7, that was not hard as a brick. Through experimentation across generations, they discovered that cooking a portion of the flour changed everything about how long the bread lasted. They did not understand gelatinization. They did not understand starch chemistry. They did not conduct laboratory analysis or write scientific papers. They understood that the bread stayed soft. They understood that the technique worked. That was enough. The knowledge became standard in Amish kitchens. Mothers taught daughters. Grandmothers supervised until the method was perfected. The practice passed through families like any other kitchen wisdom, through observation and practice rather than written instruction. The Amish did not write cookbooks. Their traditions were oral, passed from generation to generation through lived experience. The Tangjong method was never documented because Amish cooking traditions were never documented. When food scientists began studying bread staling in the 20th century, they did not consult Amish bakers. They studied commercial bread. They developed chemical solutions to problems that traditional bakers had solved naturally centuries earlier. The Amish method remained invisible to scientific literature until researchers like Dr. Buehler accidentally encountered it. The technique that had worked for 300 years was unknown to the scientists who studied bread, because the scientists never thought to look in Amish kitchens. The Amish bread tradition has a second component that works alongside the cooked flour method: sourdough. Not all Amish bread is sourdough, but much of it is, and sourdough provides additional freshness that commercial yeast cannot match. Commercial yeast is a single strain of Saccharomyces cerevisiae. It was selected for one trait above all others: speed. Commercial yeast makes dough rise in an hour. It enables the fast production schedules that commercial bakeries require. Speed has consequences. Fast fermentation does not develop flavor. It does not break down compounds that make bread difficult to digest. It does not create the organic acids that preserve bread naturally. Commercial bread rises fast and stales fast. The speed that benefits the manufacturer harms the consumer. Sourdough is different. Sourdough is not a single organism. It is an ecosystem. Wild yeasts and lactic acid bacteria living together in symbiotic relationship. Dozens of species interacting, competing, cooperating, producing compounds that no single organism can produce. The fermentation is slow. Sourdough bread rises over 12 to 24 hours, sometimes longer. During this time, the bacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid. The acids accumulate, the pH drops. The dough becomes an environment where mold and harmful bacteria cannot survive. This acidity is preservation. The organic acids in sourdough inhibit the growth of mold and spoilage organisms. Sourdough bread resists contamination longer than bread made with commercial yeast. The same loaf that would grow mold in 5 days with commercial yeast may resist mold for 10 days or more with sourdough. The acids also affect starch behavior. Lactic acid partially breaks down starch molecules during fermentation. Smaller starch fragments gelatinize more icily during baking. They resist retrogradation more effectively after baking. Sourdough bread stays soft longer because the starch has been pre-digested by bacterial acids. The long fermentation develops flavor compounds that commercial yeast cannot produce. Over 200 distinct flavor compounds have been identified in properly fermented sourdough. These compounds create the complex, tangy, slightly sweet taste that makes sourdough bread satisfying in ways that commercial bread cannot match. People who eat sourdough bread eat less of it. Each bite delivers more flavor. The satisfaction comes sooner. This is not a marketing benefit for companies that want you to consume more. It is a health benefit for consumers who want to eat better. The Amish combine both techniques. They maintain sourdough starters that have been fed continuously for generations. Some Amish families have starters that are over 100 years old. These starters contain microbial communities that have evolved together for a century, producing flavors and textures that cannot be replicated by commercial cultures purchased from a store. They prepare the cooked flour paste. They combine it with sourdough starter, additional flour, water, and salt. They ferment slowly often overnight. They bake in wood-fired ovens that produce crusts commercial ovens cannot match. The result is bread that stays soft for 2 weeks. Bread that resists mold. Bread that tastes better than anything the commercial industry produces. No additives, no preservatives, no chemicals with names you cannot pronounce. Just technique that the industry refuses to use because technique does not generate profit for chemical suppliers. Making bread with the Amish method is not difficult. It requires one additional step added to any bread recipe you already use. Take 1/5 of the flour from your recipe. If your recipe calls for 5 cups of flour, set aside 1 cup. If it calls for 500 grams, set aside 100 grams. The exact amount does not need to be precise. Approximately 1/5 is sufficient. Place this flour in a small saucepan. Add 5 times the water by weight. For 100 grams of flour, add 500 grams of water, which is approximately 2 cups. The ratio is 1 part flour to 5 parts water by weight. Whisk the flour and water together until no lumps remain. The mixture will be thin and milky, like very watery pancake batter. It will not look like anything that could become paste. It will transform. Place the saucepan over medium-low heat. Stir constantly with a wooden spoon or silicone spatula. Do not stop stirring. Do not check your phone. Do not answer the door. The mixture will scorch on the bottom if you stop stirring for even a minute, and scorched paste will ruin your bread. As the mixture heats, it will begin to thicken. This happens gradually at first, then suddenly, one moment you are stirring thin liquid, the next moment you are stirring thick paste. Continue stirring. When the mixture reaches approximately 150 degrees Fahrenheit, it will have the consistency of thick pudding. Lines drawn with your spoon will hold their shape briefly before slowly filling in. The paste will look slightly glossy. The transformation is complete. Remove from heat immediately. Continuing to cook will cause the starch to break down and lose its water-holding capacity. The goal is gelatinization, not degradation. Transfer to a bowl and cover with plastic wrap pressed directly onto the surface. This prevents a skin from forming as the paste cools. Allowed to cool to room temperature. Approximately 1 hour. When ready to mix your dough, add the cooled paste along with the remaining flour. Water, salt, and yeast or sourdough starter. Mix and knead as your recipe directs. The process from this point forward is identical to any bread you have made before. The dough will feel slightly different. It will be stickier because of the additional water held by the gelatinized starch. Resist the urge to add more flour. The stickiness is correct. It indicates that the technique is working. Knead until the dough becomes smooth and elastic. This may take slightly longer than you are used to because of the higher moisture content. The dough will eventually become manageable despite its initial stickiness. Shape and proof and bake as you normally would. The bread will rise slightly higher than usual because the gelatinized starch traps gas more effectively. The crumb will be more tender. The crust will brown beautifully because the sugars in gelatinized starch caramelize readily. Allow the bread to cool completely before slicing. This is important for any bread, but especially important for bread made with this technique. Cutting warm bread releases moisture as steam. That moisture would otherwise stay in the loaf, keeping it soft for days. Let the bread cool for at least 1 hour. Store in a cloth bag or wrapped in a clean kitchen towel. Do not store in plastic, which traps moisture against the crust and makes it soggy while the interior dries. Do not refrigerate, which accelerates staling. Room temperature in a breathable wrapper is ideal. The bread will remain soft for 2 weeks. You will slice it on day 14 and wonder why you ever bought commercial bread that went stale in 2 days. Maintaining a sourdough starter is simpler than the bread industry wants you to believe. The industry promotes the myth that sourdough is difficult, that starters require constant attention, that the process is finicky and failure-prone, that only experts with years of experience can succeed. This myth serves their interests. If sourdough seems too hard, consumers keep buying commercial bread. If starters seem too demanding, home bakers give up before they start. The myth protects the market from competition. The truth is that sourdough starters are resilient. A starter is a colony of wild yeast and bacteria. These organisms have survived for millions of years without human assistance. They do not require laboratory conditions. They do not require precise temperature control. They do not require the level of obsessive attention that baking blogs suggest. They require flour and water, that is all. To create a starter from scratch, Mix equal parts flour and water by weight in a glass jar. 50 grams flour and 50 grams water works well. Stir until no dry flour remains. Cover loosely with a cloth or loose lid. Leave at room temperature. After 24 hours, discard half the mixture and add fresh flour and water in the same amounts. Stir well, cover, and wait another 24 hours. Repeat daily. Within 5 to 7 days, the mixture will begin bubbling. The bubbles indicate fermentation. Wild yeast and bacteria have colonized your flour paste. They are consuming sugars and producing carbon dioxide and organic acids. Your starter is alive. Once established, a starter requires minimal maintenance. If you bake daily, feed daily. If you bake weekly, keep it in the refrigerator and feed once per week. If you bake monthly, refrigerate it and feed monthly. Starters can survive weeks without feeding. They go dormant, but they do not die. When you feed them again, they revive. Stories of starters killed by neglect are mostly exaggerated. Starters are survivors. The Amish maintain starters for generations without obsessing over them. They feed when they bake. They keep starters in cool pantries or root cellars. They do not fuss over temperatures or schedules. The starters persist because persistence is what starters do. The economics of home bread making destroy the commercial model. A loaf of commercial bread costs $3 to $5 depending on brand and quality. That loaf lasts 2 to 4 days before becoming unpleasantly stale. A family consuming a loaf every 2 days spends approximately $50 to $75 per month on bread. A loaf of homemade bread costs approximately 50 cents in ingredients, flour, water, salt, and the negligible cost of maintaining a sourdough starter. A loaf made with the Amish method lasts 2 weeks. A family consuming a loaf every 2 weeks spends approximately $2 per month on bread. The savings exceed $50 per month. Over a year, the savings exceeds $600. Over a decade, the savings exceeds $6,000. But the economics understate the value. Homemade bread does not contain preservatives linked to behavioral problems. It does not contain compounds banned as carcinogens in other countries. It does not contain the dozens of additives that commercial bread uses to simulate the quality that proper technique achieves naturally. The health value of avoiding these additives cannot be calculated in dollars, but it is real. The time investment is modest. The cooked flour paste takes 10 minutes to prepare. Mixing and kneading take 15 minutes. Rising happens while you sleep or work or live your life. Shaping takes 5 minutes. The second rise happens while you do other things. Baking takes 35 to 45 minutes while you do other things. Active labor per loaf is approximately 30 minutes. For bread that lasts 2 weeks, this is 2 minutes per day. The commercial bread industry would have you believe that baking is too difficult and too time-consuming for modern life. This belief serves their interests, not yours. The Amish bake bread while also running farms and raising children, and building furniture and maintaining households without electricity. If they have time to bake, you have time to bake. The constraint is not time. The constraint is knowledge. Knowledge that the technique exists. Knowledge that 5 extra minutes creates 2 extra weeks of freshness. Knowledge that preservatives are profitable for industry but not necessary for bread. This knowledge was standard a century ago. Every household knew how to bake. Every family maintained bread traditions. The knowledge was so basic that it needed no special transmission. Then convenience was sold as progress. Commercial bread became available. It cost money but saved time. It contained preservatives but freed homemakers from the kitchen. It was inferior in every way, but it was easy. Within 2 generations, the knowledge that had been universal became rare. Home baking became a hobby rather than a skill. Bread traditions that had persisted for thousands of years were broken within decades. The Amish never bought convenience. They never accepted the trade. They kept their knowledge while the culture around them forgot. Their bread stays fresh for 2 weeks because they remember what we were made to forget. You have been buying bread that goes stale in 2 days because you believed fresh bread required preservatives. You believed this because the bread industry wanted you to believe it. They sold you bread loaded with chemicals. They told you the chemicals were necessary. They told you that bread without chemicals would fail. They showed you no alternatives because alternatives would destroy their market. The Amish have been proving them wrong for 300 years. 3 centuries of bread that stays fresh without chemicals. 3 centuries of technique passed from mother to daughter. 3 centuries of knowledge that the industry hoped would never escape those communities. Now you know. You know that cooking a portion of the flour transforms everything. You know that gelatinized starch holds water that keeps bread soft. You know that 5 minutes of preparation creates 2 weeks of freshness. You know that sourdough fermentation extends freshness further. You know that the combination of cooked flour and sourdough creates bread that commercial bakeries cannot match despite their laboratories and their chemicals. You know that the preservatives in commercial bread are not necessary. They are profitable. There is a difference between necessary and profitable. The industry obscures this difference because clarity would cost them money. You can continue buying commercial bread. Continue consuming preservatives linked to behavioral problems in children. Continue eating compounds banned as carcinogens in other developed nations. Continue supporting an industry that profits from bread that fails quickly, or you can bake. 1 small saucepan, 10 minutes of stirring, a handful of flour and water transformed into paste that transforms bread. Bread that stays soft for 2 weeks. Bread that contains nothing you cannot pronounce. Bread that your great-great-grandmother would recognize as bread. The Amish kept this knowledge for 300 years. They did not keep it because they wanted to exclude others. They kept it because no one thought to ask them. No one thought that people without electricity might know something that industrial bakeries did not. They knew. They have always known. Today, you know too. If this video helped you, subscribe and hit the bell. Every share bakes what they wanted you to buy. The next video opens soon.